Welcome to MrClaff.com's review of World War II, brought to you by Noble Review, concise review books. Let's first look at who the major powers were of the war. The Axis powers were made up of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, Benito Mussolini's Italy, and Emperor Hirohito's Japan. The major Allied powers to know were Winston Churchill's Britain, Charles de Gaulle's Free French Forces of France, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union, and President Franklin Roosevelt's United States, who would enter the war in 1941. After several years of appeasement, or giving in to Hitler's desires, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany after Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. The Nazis used a Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, of immense air and land forces to quickly topple Poland. After taking over Denmark and Norway, the Nazis looked to France in 1940. France fell quickly to Germany as the Allies evacuated to Britain. Other Allies escaped as well after the Battle of Dunkirk. Britain was left alone, but their Royal Air Force fought bravely to resist the Blitzkrieg of London. Hitler turned his forces to the east and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. This action broke the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939. After the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942, the Soviets pushed back the German offensive. Like Napoleon over a century earlier, the German army had a hard time mobilizing in the harsh Russian winter. The United States maintained its neutrality early in the war. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 37, and 39 kept America neutral mostly in terms of arms shipments to foreign countries. Cash and carry was a 1939 policy proclaiming that the United States would aid Britain, but only if the British came to the U.S. on their own ships, paid in cash, and then left with the weapons. The Destroyers for Bases deal of 1940 avoided upsetting those who favored neutrality, as FDR traded older large ships in exchange for British bases in the Caribbean. Most important was the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which allowed the United States to sell unlimited weapons to the Allies. The buying was done on credit, and over $50 billion in supplies were sent overseas. For the United States, it's also important to note that the soldiers were being drafted before the war ever began. This was the first peacetime draft in United States history. The U.S. entered the war after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 2,300 American soldiers were killed, many aboard the USS Arizona. The Allies began fighting in northern Africa and then went north to liberate Italy. The turning point of the European theater was D-Day, which led to the liberation of France. General Dwight Eisenhower was the Allied commander. The Battle of the Bulge was the deadliest battle of the war for the Americans. It was Germany's last desperate offensive. It failed, and Adolf Hitler killed himself shortly before VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, was declared. The Americans fought on a second front in the Pacific. There, General Douglas MacArthur was the commander of the island-hopping strategy. The Allies attacked islands such as Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa leading up to Japan. However, there would be no mainland invasion of Japan, as after FDR died in 1945, President Harry Truman put in the order for the Enola Gay to drop Little Boy, or the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima. About 140,000 people were killed. A second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, leading to an estimated 70,000 deaths. Shortly after, the Japanese unconditionally surrendered, and VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, was declared. On the American home front, women stepped into the factories and were nicknamed Rosie the Riveter. Native Americans left their reservations to work in defense plants and were also code talkers overseas. Unions agreed not to strike so materials could be produced. There was much rationing of meat, gasoline, and iron, which was critical for supply lines. Also, to pay for the war, taxes were raised, and purchasing of war bonds was encouraged. The war cost the United States about $288 billion. The Japanese on the west coast of the U.S. were greatly affected by the war. Executive Order 9066 permitted the United States government to transform the west coast into a military zone, and about 120,000 Japanese Americans were relocated and forced to live in internment camps spaced throughout the country. This action was challenged by the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. However, the Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment, though guaranteeing equality in regular instances, could be denied in a time of war. Regarding the peace process, there are several conferences to know. Most important was Yalta. In this conference, the Soviet Union gained control over much of Eastern Europe. Though they promised free elections, these promises were empty, and nations were turned into satellites of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. Also in this conference, the Soviets agreed to enter the war in Japan, and it was decided that Germany would become divided into zones after the war. Other conferences to know were Tehran, where the Allies planned the end-of-the-war strategy to defeat the Nazis, and Potsdam, where the Allies discussed the fate of Germany upon surrender. Furthermore, after the war, it's important to know about the Nuremberg trials, which seeked justice for the atrocities of the Holocaust. However, only 22 Nazis were charged with crimes against humanity. 12 were sentenced to death. Hundreds of Nazi officers were never tried. In the war, an estimated 60 million people perished, with over one-third of the casualties coming from the Soviet Union. The war left two superpowers to fight for control of the world, the United States and the USSR. If you would like to view a video about the Cold War, click here. For more review, you can find free flashcards and review sheets at MrKlaff.com. We also invite you to check out Noble Review in both paperback and ebook formats. Best of luck on your tests.